Good morning, everyone. Today I'm here at Oakwood Cemetery, and today I want to answer a question that probably not a lot of you have ever asked yourselves before, but one that might actually prove to be quite interesting. That is the question of what happened to the original headstones that were here at Oakwood Cemetery. Now, today we're starting from the location of from where one of the two photographs that John Reekes would take in 1865, specifically April 1865, of the cemetery. He would take a photograph here and then one further down the hill, which I actually have made a video about previously, and I'll make sure I link it in the description or in the video in the time card. Now, in those photographs, there are a large number of headstones, which today, as you can see, you don't see any. All you have here are these grave markers, or as I like to call them, plot markers, because they mark the different plots where graves are located. Now, we'll go ahead and head on down this road. We'll head towards the location of where the other photograph was taken. Well, I'm doing that there. I'll talk a little bit more about what happened to those original headstones. Now, back during the war, resources such as stone, for example, would be a little bit harder to come by, and due to the large number of deaths that would occur, there was the need to try to mark at least some of these graves overall. So what would happen is, during the war, these graves would eventually be marked out, but they wouldn't be marked with, say, stone markers. They would be marked out with wooden markers. Usually wooden markers that were made out of any scrap wood that they could find at the time. Now, this isn't something that happens particularly just during the war. This happens as well after the war, and is actually somewhat more of a common tradition during the time, where if you couldn't really afford to buy a headstone, usually you would use a wooden marker of some sort to mark out where your grave is located. Or if your family doesn't have the money, they would, of course, try to get a chunk of wood and mark where your grave is. Now, out west, you actually have a number of these examples that are contemporary to the time period, which exist all throughout, say, for example, Tombstone, Arizona, places like that there where these original markers were located. Now, what happened to the original markers here is that the original markers, over the years, simply rotted away. And even during the post-war years, very early on, it was recorded that a lot of these markers were simply rotting away, falling over. It didn't look good over here at all. And in 1865, you can actually see this with the other iconic photograph of the cemetery, which was taken roughly around this location here, where you can see a lot of the headstones are bent, they're falling backwards, they're very much rough, ready-made, we made this in a rush sort of headstones. And eventually what would happen is that the Ladies Association that would eventually come to try to improve the cemetery would eventually get all of the original headstones and get rid of them, and then replace them with new markers sometime in the 1860s and early 1870s. However, these markers were again made out of wood, and they would eventually start rotting away as well. And for a time period, there were no headstones out here, though the general location of where all these places were located were kept in the logs and records of that time period. So what eventually happened was that during the 20th century, the Daughters of the Confederacy, as well as the same Ladies Association that helped rebuild this, effectively preserve this entire cemetery, would come out here and place these markers like the ones you have back here, which would mark out each individual plot. And if the grave wasn't identified at the time and didn't have a marker at the time, at least then you would know roughly or near exactly where the person would be buried. Now, there are actually similar markers like these in other cemeteries. One of the more notable examples I can think about are the national cemeteries, such as, for example, Seven Pines National Cemetery, Cold Harbor National Cemetery. A lot of the national cemeteries use similar markers to do a similar thing, where they record how many burials are in that location and what plot area is it located at within the cemetery, to keep an organization of what areas are available for future burials, what areas are already occupied, and potentially how many people are occupying that area. And in some cases you have markers for burial trenches, which actually I've been to a couple of them before, which, if you want to know where they're at, they're up in Cold Harbor National Cemetery. So in the end, what happened to the original markers is that they were made out of wood. They just rotted away, and especially in Virginia's moist, humid climate, wood rots extremely quickly. Which is why having wooden markers out here in this entire area is a terrible idea, and why stone is usually preferred for grave markers to begin with. Now, in the deserts of Arizona, where these surviving examples of wooden headstones still exist today, the climate is a lot drier, it's a lot less humid, which means that wood tends to survive a lot better in that environment and is less likely to rot away, which is why we have all these examples from the 1870s, some as early as the 1860s, roughly around the same time as the markers that were originally around here. So, I hope you learned something today, and I hope everyone has a wonderful day, and may God bless all of you.